Hi, I'm Paul. For this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ego, but I'm going to talk about it in a slightly different way. I'm also going to lead it on a little bit into seeking and what seeking is and how that works. But the idea of this is first, I'm going to describe the first time that I seen my ego. However, I didn't know that it was my ego. I had no idea. In fact, I didn't know anything about it, but it was the first time I went, my first session in therapy. I'm sure I spoke about it in one of my videos a long time ago, but the idea of it really is what I'm trying to suggest is if what we're trying to find is the truth, perhaps move past the ego and try and find the truth. I think one of the biggest failures in this is to try and find the truth. You see, if we're going to try and find the truth and we don't know what it is we're looking for, then this would just lead into seeking for more. Or this is part of seeking. But anyway, I'm going to start off this really with just talking about the first time that I seen the ego in a slightly different way than I've described before. So when I first went to therapy, it was my first ever session. Before I went into my first session, I drew a picture and I took it into my therapist to show him, to say this is where my problem is. And I think that's pretty much what I said. But I said I don't understand it. And the picture what I drew was a picture of a man. And behind the man was a barbed wire fence. The barbed wire fence was a very heavily guarded barbed wire fence. You see, behind the barbed wire fence was a young child. The young child was, let's say, frightened. So you see, this man who was stood in front of the fence, when I said to the therapist, this is what seems to be the problem, but I don't understand it, the man who was in front of the fence was the ego. Now, I've said before that the ego is the attachment to thought. You could also say attachment to knowledge or attachment to memory. So if we create an image of ourselves and we kind of become attached to that image and try to fulfill this image, we're always seeking for something to sustain the image as the image is constantly trying to crumble. Like I've described before, it's like having a cup with a hole in it. Each time you try to fill up the cup with desire or excitement or seeking or chasing, the cup starts to empty continuously. So you're always seeking for more. Now, the idea of this person, or the adult in front of the fence, was the adult was trying to defend the child. We could possibly say that the child would be the real me, or we could say the child would be feelings or insight, or possibly even the truth. I think it's probably all of them combined. But the person or the adult in front of the fence was trying to defend anything getting through from a child. I mean, you can see this with an ego. Let's say somebody tries to say something that you don't want to hear. The ego deflects or fights back, argues, denies, rejects, so on. So this is the ego, the man in front of the fence trying to defend the child behind, and the child is feelings, insight, so on. Now, this was the first time I went into therapy, and I didn't know what it was. I didn't know that this was what the ego was. I just had this image in my head, and I drew the image, and I said, this is what my problem is. So the thing is, the person who stood in front of the fence, the ego who's trying to defend, and you see, this is a false image. So it doesn't really have any energy of its own. It needs to kind of gain energy to sustain itself. That's why it seems to be constantly crumbling. Unless you're perhaps seeking for more, or seeking for the, let's say, seeking for the attachment to thought. Oh, no, that's not right. So the ego, which is trying to protect the child, which can't sustain its own energy, is always seeking for more, perhaps in a way of desire, excitement. You see, as long as it can sustain itself and it keeps itself going. In the case of a collapse, the ego collapses and you feel like you're wounded, in fact, very wounded, because the child has no defense. The idea of what we call spirituality, I don't like using the idea of spirituality because a lot of people believe that it's some mystic sort of spiritual. I just don't think that's the way to look at it. See, I think if you start looking at it like that, that's when the ego tries to cling on. You see, some of us can have an ego of, I don't know, wanting to seek money, and all of a sudden things start to go wrong. But then this attachment to thought needs to gain some other structure for it to contain its energy, let's say. And if spirituality or the idea of coming awake or non-duality or so on can give us something to attach to. When I say give us something to attach to, I mean give the ego, the attachment to thought, some food for thought, I guess is what I'm saying. So anything would be food for thought. You see, as long as there's food for thought, there's something to attach to. Obviously, we don't want this to be negative, horrible thoughts. So we're always trying to seek for more. So as I said before, that trying to find the truth, whilst trying to seek for the truth, can only be something that the ego attaches onto. In other words, more food for thought. The more of a mystery it is, the longer it takes to find it, then the more food for thought there is. See, I'm not sure if this is the only way what I'm about to say to try and find the truth. Maybe there is other ways, but I'm reasonably sure, at least for the majority of people, I think this is probably the only way of finding the truth. And the idea is to find the truth in the false. When I say find the truth in the false, perhaps when thoughts come, or desires, or interests, wants, needs, or just the way that maybe the ego works, if you start to see that, then you can start seeking through, or searching through, the way that your mind feels to be attached to the ego, or if you get any sort of glances of the ego. Perhaps even in meditation, when you're meditating and you find yourself keep on becoming attached to thought again, which you can see this quite easily. You see, thought doesn't go away even in meditation. Thought can still continue. I mean, sometimes I do get it where thought does entirely go away, but not always. So thought can still stay there. Now, as long as you've got, if I say, your eye on thought, and when I say your eye on thought, I just mean awareness, or your attention on thought. Maybe you can just observe it from a distance in your mind. Then that's not attached to it. But let's say the thought gets interesting or even scary, and all of a sudden awareness disappears and you become attached to thought. In other words, it appears that, let's say you're hypnotized into thought because there's no awareness anymore. There's a blank spot. And all of a sudden you notice that you're gone into the desire of thoughts. Then you just pull yourself back and notice that it happened. You see, when you see yourself attached to it and then pull yourself back, you can take a look at what happened. You can see what truth there is in it. You can take a look at how desirable being attached to the thought was. You can take a look at how it so easily caught your attention, consumed you. Maybe it's because of fear. Maybe it's just wanting to think of something exciting or desire. You see, like I was saying about the ego being the person in front of the fence, the adult, trying to seek more food for thought. If you're entirely that person, you see, the child behind the fence back in the earlier days before therapy for me, the child behind the fence had no input into my life at all, just scared. So you see, if I'm just the person or the adult in front of the fence, when I'm just the ego, how are you supposed to see the ego when you are the ego? So when attached to thought, how am I supposed to see that I'm attached to thought? No, I'm not sure really that you can. So I think the idea is you do need to gain some sort of awareness first. In other words, take a step back away from your thought to a position where you could at least observe your thought, maybe for 1 or 2 seconds or more, and build it up and build it up. And the more you put to it, the easier it gets. So in some way we could say that the child behind the fence who was scared is awareness. I'm not suggesting you should focus in your head on the child, probably. That'll drift you away a little bit. But what I'm saying is finding truth. I don't think you can find it by trying to find truth. In other words, somebody comes up and says, look, this is what truth is. This is spiritual awakening. This is higher consciousness. In fact, if I said that what we need to find is higher consciousness, well, if you've not seen what that is, maybe you've heard it off several people, but I don't even think that comes close to actually seeing what it is yourself. If you've not seen what it is, what happens? It becomes more food for thought, more fulfilling for the ego, something for the ego to grab onto. The ego doesn't know what it's searching for, but it doesn't care, as long as it's occupied. Like I say, I think the only way really is to try to search. I mean, would this be searching in the past still? Perhaps, in some occasions, and also searching in the present. So if you're meditating, let's say, then you just relax. And whatever crops up, observe it. Anyway, I think that's all I've got to say. I thought it was going to be a really short video, but I waffled on for a fair few minutes, I think. So thank you very much for listening.